This is episode number 20 of Technology and Choice, where we talk about most anything because, hey, what is technology? It is the knowledge, the insights, the tools, the patterns that we use to influence the world around us. And indeed, that includes each other. I like to think about that one. And choice, what is that? That's, well, our choices affect how technology develops, and the technology affects our choices. But I've always got to point out that choice is that little string that if you pull on it, it's connected right to your very existence, whether it's real or not. I hear these debates about, free will is an illusion. Well, who cares? You still got it. That's what you're using to interface with me. So choice is connected right there. And I won't beat that up too much right now, but I like to share those. This episode, we have something I've really been looking forward to. This is the fourth in the Hemp Corner series, which it was just pointed out to me. The Hemp Corner also stands for THC, just like THC Magazine. That came up. It came up the other night. Anyway, but one of the fascinating things about exploring cannabis as a whole area is it was brought to my attention that, hey, we have a long relationship with this plant as a species, and as both human species and plant species. There's been a lot of interaction to the point where, some years ago it was discovered that we have an entire chemical relationship with the plant. We have a whole system of cellular interactions that relate directly to the compounds that those plants create. And I thought, well, that's fabulous, fascinating. But I also realized I really don't know what the heck that's about. And I wanted to explore it. And so, I'll get right into introducing our guest, who's going to help us through it. Dr. Jim Laurenzano is actually he's been a follower of my podcasts and reached out and connected to me some time ago, and we've been communicating. And recently, we were talking and found out he's probably the perfect person to help guide us through this. So, as I say, Dr. Jim, he's a doctor, and I'm going to pass this over to you, Jim, to give us, what you want to share. Welcome to Technology and Choice.
John, thank you very much for welcoming me. Yes, I have been a faithful follower of yours. Your initial podcast about the SAFE network, right. And then when you branched out to this, I also enjoyed it. I am also on a learning journey. The journey is to learn about cannabis, because in medicine we clearly need to learn a whole lot more about it. It's been relatively recently that we even learned about the compound that makes cannabis do what it does. And it's been even more recently, only about 20 to 30 years ago, where we figured out there are receptors in our brain that are activated by the compounds in cannabis.
Well, no, that's the point that I'm really hoping to get your help with, as we've discussed, is that you mentioned receptors, and I've used that and I've said it, but I go, really, what is that? What does it mean? And you've helped guide me through. You've given me some material, and it opened up an incredible vista, which goes far beyond just understanding the cannabis relationship, but you can't really understand that until you get a bigger scene. So that's what we're trying to do. But before we go into that, what more do you want to share about yourself, or what you that just so the folks can be familiar with you?
I've been practicing medicine for 35 years now. I still enjoy taking care of people. My interest is in patient-oriented healthcare with using shared decision-making. And cannabis ties into this because it's certainly become medically legal in some states, and for personal use is a separate issue. Right. And I'm board certified in emergency medicine. I am presently working as the medical director of a correctional facility, and my areas of interest are learning and sharing information with patients, especially presenting it in a way so they can understand it, so they can make decisions that will benefit them, but at least have them informed.
Fabulous. Well, that's the perfect orientation from my perspective. You encouraging participation rather than dictating. That's what we're trying to do on this show too. Okay, so tell you what, was there more you wanted to say on what you were saying regarding cannabis, or should we launch in and those things will probably
I would
work out?
recommend. I think it'll come out in the discussion. Also, if you want, I can share medical sides of things that might make it more interesting to the average person as it relates to patient well-being. But that'll continue in the discussion, and if I get too
Right.
long-winded, just let me know.
Rein you in. Okay. Well, good, because in our discussions, I know that you really have a passion about that. But what I really want to accomplish first off is a little bit of a framework to hang the specific benefits of the endocannabinoids system and the relationship to cannabis, to hemp, not just the marijuana side, but the whole spectrum of cannabis. Overlaying that, we need to understand some biochemistry, which seems like a tall order, but I think we can get there. And so what we've done for the audience is Jim and I started talking about this a little while back, and he sent me some references and really opened my eyes. And so I've distilled that as best I can. So if you think it's a good idea, Jim, I'm going to rattle for a little bit here to give the framework of understandings that I've got, and then you can help me flesh it out, because we did this a little bit the other day, and I was further enlightened. So I think we can all be there. So I'm doing my simpleton filter here.
That's right, and I enjoy your simpleton filter, because the hardest thing in medicine, I find, is distilling it. Not that I can understand it, but the patient can understand it. That is the hardest thing. I have a vast amount of knowledge and experience, but if they can't understand the code and the data, it cannot be transformed to information that can be acted upon. So this is what I enjoy about listening to you, and you clearly opened my eyes about the SAFE network and the beauty of it. And I only wish I could be a simpleton also.
Well, we can't all be. Somebody's got to be a geek. You're a medical geek, so we're going to engage here. All right. So now, anybody who's listened to, and if you haven't, I encourage you to go back and listen to the first 3 episodes in the Hemp Corner. I don't remember what the technology and choice numbers are, but you can find them. There is in cannabis a parallel biological relationship to the human body and to human civilization that goes back into all recorded history, at least 10,000 years of interaction with this plant. Oh, and I'm going to recommend a book here called it's called A Botany of Desire, which talks about the interrelationships of man and plants on the basis of fulfilling each other's needs. And cannabis, mainly in the form of marijuana, is one of the topics of that. So highly recommend it. But the cannabis plant has compounds that the human body depends upon to regulate biological functions, and they call it the endocannabinol system, which was about 20 years ago it was discovered.
Yes, like John, it was about 20 to 30 years ago. We don't depend on cannabis for the endocannabinol system to work. We have an internal system that we can take external chemicals, the compounds in cannabis, that will make that system work.
Right.
So it's an endogenous, meaning inside system, where we can actuate it by sending, in this case, chemical signals to those receptors, which make the body do what the endocannabinol system is hardwired to do.
Good. Well, that's a good place to step off, because it's it is something the body does, and that means, okay, well, it's been in prohibition for a while, and somehow or another we've continued to function and find some ways of fulfilling those things. But the main point I was looking at is that, and especially from the perspective of a botany of desire, which is a really good study of how plants and humans have interacted over time, kind of fulfilling each other's needs. Like apples got spread all over because they were doing things that people liked, and they did more of them when given the chance. And cannabis is very similar. So we've got a system there that works biologically, and it looks like, just hypothetically, it looks like cannabis having the flexibility genetically has gone, oh, well, we'll try this. Oh, and they use that. Okay, well, then that gets propagated more. And so over time, we've gotten this whole set of functions that interrelate very closely. Is that a pretty good summation?
Yes, I would agree. I would first of all say The Botany of Desire is not written for medical professionals,
No,
written for the lay public. It is a beautifully written book. If I have to say, it's a beautifully written book. The science is correct, but that's the easy part. Yeah. How beautifully it's written and how codependent, and how it's been mutually beneficial for apples, potatoes, cannabis, and the other one was tulips.
Yeah.
But how we've evolved, and that we found it beneficial for both the plant and ourselves to get a closer relationship, because we found benefit to it, and the plant then gets propagated, which is beneficial to the plant.
Right. Exactly. And now that's really good. So that's very good to establish that as the basis of, well, it wasn't like we were necessarily created together or meant to be together or whatnot, but over a long period of history, that interrelationship has developed where so many different things which we're able to use to improve and sustain the human biological function is presented by the plant. And then over the last 80, 90 years, that's been in prohibition. We may have suffered from the lack of those things too. That gets into that brings me to another recommendation you gave me not long ago, and I got the audiobook and listened to it. It's called Chasing the Scream, which both of these books I will link in the show notes. But Chasing the Scream was a wonderful, a very heavy, emotionally impacting book, basically about how this whole prohibition came about. And the consequences of it are really far-reaching and fabulous. So I've got to thank you again for introducing me to that. And I encourage everybody who has the slightest bit of interest to get a hold of it, because it's very meaningful, very meaningful. Anyway, you were going to say something there?
I would agree, John. The Chasing the Scream I found beautifully written, telling a very emotional story, very well reasoned. The medical facts are very well laid out. And I think so highly of the book that I tell my friends, and I even offered to you, if you don't like it, I'll reimburse the cost of it. And it is well worth everyone's time. And there's a TED Talk the author, Hari, presents that I find very moving. It's about 20 minutes long.
I'll see if I can find that TED Talk and link it in the show notes as well. So you made me that offer, and I didn't have to take you up on the reimbursement. Did I get you correct that you're making that offer to the listeners?
There must be a miscommunication on the Skype line, John.
No, that's fine. Hey, that's pretty bold. I didn't want to commit you. Okay, but anyway. No, it's a fabulous book. I'm sure you won't regret it if you actually consume it. All right, so great. So now let's get down to the biochemistry level, because the way it's communicated is this whole endocannabinoid system in the body is a series of receptors that are specifically designed to, or at least which the cannabis plant is specifically designed to interact with. That's probably a better way of putting it, rather than the receptors are designed to interact with cannabis.
Correct. The receptors are very specific that sit on the cell. Think of the old antennas that used to sit on the roofs of buildings. They sit there and they have a certain shape and orientation. And then when the transmitter hits that receptor, if it fits perfectly, it activates it. Sometimes there may be more than one that are required to make it activate. We talked about the idea of multi-sig as being an analogy where you have to hit maybe two antennas or two receptors, two signals have to hit it, and then it tells the body activate it. So there are chemicals that are close enough that fit that antenna. Our body has specific chemicals to activate the endo, meaning inside cannabinoid system, but the external signals, THC mainly, the euphoric agent, and cannabidiol, hit different receptors, and then it tells the cell, do something. Now, the cell doesn't just have the endocannabinoid system. It has many, many, many receptors, many different classes. One that's very close to it is the endogenous endorphin or opiate-like receptors. They link very closely. So our body has internal chemicals that tell us feel less pain, modulate pain, forget this pain. So it's a very complex web of signals and feedback loops that activate what the body is to do.
Cool. Well, that brings up a couple things. One is you kind of described a receptor. Yeah, and well, I want to cover that more. But you said activate. You know, when a receptor is activated by being interacted with, a exact enough match to get it to do something. What does that mean? Activate.
Well, it'll tell when the match is made. If you think of a TV receptor and a signal coming in this case, the TV would show a picture. But in this case, in the cell, it tells the cell to maybe release chemicals or to do a pre-programmed function, such as fire across this nerve ending or don't let this signal go across. So these are pre-programmed with a lot of variables, but it tells the body to do certain things depending on where these signals are located in the body.
Okay, so and that we've talked about. You've got the endocannabinol system and the endorphin system, or are there others? I mean, I assume that this is like all cells have some kind of interaction along the line, right?
Correct. Now, by the way, the receptors are not uniformly spread. Even among the endocannabinol system, parts of the brain are more activated than other parts, and the cells have millions of receptors because there's a lot of signals coming through. Now, some chemicals don't need receptors, but a lot of them, the cells have developed this is the best match through evolution, that we want it to hit this, and if it hits this, we want this to go off. So you have receptors for tetanus, immunity. You have receptors for eating. You have receptors for pleasure. All the functions that we know of, there's almost always receptors. So a cell membrane would have millions of these spread across it.
Cool. So now let's take a closer look at what a receptor is, because this I found really fascinating. Receptors are basically protein molecules that occur on the surface of cells, right? They're something like that.
Most of them are proteins. Some of them have sugars on them. Some of them have fat molecules. But it's not just a linear string.
That was the part I really wanted to explore, because when I first thought of this, I thought, well, there's this linear string and it's got this binary matchup, and I mean that in itself would give a tremendous amount of flexibility. You know, even just a binary string, and you find something that matches some part of that binary string and it activates. But the protein molecules aren't just two-dimensional or so let's go into this.
Sure. Think of it as a zipper. You've got one half of the zipper. If it's a straight line, things that are close enough would lay on it, and it might activate it. But this zipper is coiled in 3 dimensions, and also there's electrical bonds between it. So it's not just a straight line of information. That is one level of complexity. based on the number of amino acids, which is there's more than 20. So now you got a lot of variable, but now when you start bending it and folding it, then the complexity goes up astronomically. So the number of combinations is unbelievable.
So you get three-dimensional spatial matches. So it's like fitting two pieces of something together is much more exacting, so it can be much more discriminating, right?
Much more discriminating, much more specific. So if you think of a line of spaghetti, that's pretty easy. Now
Right.
put a bowl of spaghetti together with all the convolutions, the bends, and try to describe that informationally wise. The complexity is astounding.
Cool. And I'm just for a visual, I want to now go back and touch on your antenna analogy because I like we were talking about it before. Folks in the modern age probably don't understand what a rooftop full of television antennas and the like looked like. You know, it's not just a straight up antenna. So they're all kind of different shapes and things pointing out, poking out in different directions. And it's more like something, the surface of, hey, what about the surface of a Borg cube? You know, it's got all of these three-dimensional implants with things sticking out. And I thought that was a really good image.
John, may I present another image for you?
Absolutely.
I'm in New England, and I'm looking outside, and there are trees, and that is a perfect analogy because there are, in this case, a red maple out front, but not all red maples are the same. The exact same species, but many variations. So the receptor for that red maple may fit this one, but not the one that's down the road. And then you've got all the species out there. So if you look at a forest, all these different trees, everybody can imagine that has to fit that tree.
Right.
That tree and only that tree or something close enough. If it's close enough, it might fire it off. But if it doesn't match it, it will not fire off. Now you can imagine with the branching and the leaves, it may only bind when there's leaves on the tree or when the leaves are down. Now you're getting into such astronomical numbers. We're now talking about a very complicated amount of numbers.
Wow. And that draws back to my thinking about the cryptocurrency and networking space where, hey, 2 to the 64th is a very easy thing to write and actually to qualify, but to wrap your wits around how big a variety that's like, I think is compared to more than the number of atoms in the visible universe plus about half again that much or something like that. It's kind of like, whoa. So and you get into multi-signature possibilities or various cryptographic filters, which would allow some things through according to certain. So that's an analogy for those who think electronically, and to get down to kind of an organic parallel to the intelligence of this system we're talking about. It's like it allows for very specific kinds of interaction, communication, and flexibility on a decentralized model. So
yes, and I would agree. I remember my background is I'm not a biochemist, but I have to understand enough and make sense of enough to explain the complexities. And the other, I think the cryptocurrency is an excellent thought process and thought experiment because most of all, your audience will understand it. The second thing is we're dealing with a analog, not a digital, but an analog information system. And as much as 2 to the 64th power is, as I told you the other day, one of the greatest transfers of information that occurs is when a baby is conceived and all that genetic information. Fantastic. This is unbelievable, the amount of information and complexity that is passed on. Excuse me.
yeah,
So I think the idea of a cryptocurrency or amount of stored information in a digital format. Now it's in a chemical analog format. And this allows for all those possibilities that we talked about with the cells and the endocannabinol system.
Wow. That's cool. I was thinking of the view of, I was thinking of the Matrix, and, when it goes into the Matrix view and you get all these things fly, take that and shift it to, okay, now let's do that in analog, and it just makes the world look different. Okay.
Agreed.
So that's really cool. So we have these different receptors, which are usually protein molecules, which this is something people are used to thinking of protein as that's what muscles are made of. But let's examine a little bit more just briefly about what is a protein molecule and what different things does it do. They're built out of amino acids, which is a particular kind of set of chemical structures, and that gives a lot of flexibility. But can we get a little bit a better definition of that and why it's important? Because
sure, the proteins do many things. Obviously, they're a big structural component of the human body. They form your muscles, but they also serve a useful function because of their shapes and the amount of amino acids that go into them. It's over 20, so the number of possibilities is astronomical. So it's a messenger of information that is contained on your inheritance or your DNA that is then transcribed to proteins. And proteins are the most common chemicals that are made to carry out the pre-programmed instructions.
Oh, okay. So they interact most readily with the DNA to.
Well, the DNA is when the DNA is read, it is in a binary. Well, it's in a code. There's four nucleosides or nucleotides, and that is transcribed. That information that is in the DNA helix splits open, and it has to be transcribed to a format that the cell will follow. And that's what the protein normally does. The protein is the result of that book being opened, and now it says, now we want to make this molecule to carry out this function. Maybe carry oxygen in your body, or to transmit across nerve signals, or as a structural component. So there's many different uses. Again, you're making me flash back to 35 years of medical school on this level, but that's the basic things. The proteins are astoundingly ubiquitous, very varied, and they just don't form one function. They transmit information in a chemical analog format, and the body uses it as a signaler, as I could say. It takes that genetic information and then tells the body what to do with it.
Fabulous. Well, I thought it was really important to explore that concept of protein, because we just hear, well, that protein, well, that's what you get when you eat a bar and it says that percentage, and you need that because it builds your muscles. That is the most common conception of what protein is.
A calorie. It's a form of stored energy, but it's also a form of stored information.
Exactly, and that's the point I really wanted to bring forward.
That's an important thing. And the other way to think about how the cell membrane looks, as I try to help with better analogies, and you're teasing it out of me, think of a busy seaport, let's say Houston or something like that. There are a lot of boats. Well, the cell membrane is like an oil sheen. It's a globe, but there are these boats floating on, and that's what the proteins look like. They stick up, so they have a way on a flat surface of being attached easily and activating that particular function.
Cool. Wow. Well, that is really good stuff. Now, when you step into any field like this, it's kind of like, okay, well, now we're right in the midst of biochemistry, and this is reminiscent of, well, let's see, now I understand a little bit. As a doctor, you've studied in all these pieces, and suddenly the pieces start to fit together, and you see a bigger picture.
That's true,
right? But when somebody from the outside comes in, it gets too complicated too fast. So this is where I'm going, ooh, we could go so many different directions here.
Well, if we do, I'm going to have to my last child is now a third-year medical student, so if he listens to this podcast, I'm sure I'll be getting some negative feedback.
Well, no, well, people understand that this is a high level. This is viewing from up high, where
Yes.
the exact details are not important. You can't even see them. So that's what we're trying to convey here, and I definitely feel enlightened so far. I was mainly saying that because, well, let's see, where do we go from here? Well, we're here to talk about hemp or cannabis generally. So I think we've laid, okay, well, there's this biochemical interaction that the plant really supplies a number of these things which are very rare otherwise. In other words, I know that there are exocannabinol sources other than hemp. But nowhere,
Correct.
I mean, you can get, there's certain fruits and this and that, and you can get little bits and pieces of these chemicals outside of the human body, but nowhere are they in such a concentration and variety and mutable variety as in the whole cannabis species. Is that a fairly, or genus, I think is more correct?
Well, number one, I think that's a good way to put it because the endocannabinol system clearly evolved in all mammals and other species too, well before there were flowering plants. It's just that it was hardwired into us. So then when we came in contact with cannabis and the chemicals acted with our endogenous system, we said it provided some benefit. Okay, so as it provided that benefit and activated the system that had been designed and is in our body, we said this is beneficial and maybe decreasing pain or decreasing inflammation. So this system was designed, well, it evolved long before we ran into cannabis, but cannabis activated and we found it beneficial.
Right. We won't go into the concept of design and intelligence, though there is so much obvious intelligence in this. I don't know where it comes from or what I don't pretend to know, so we won't have an opinion on that. But I don't want to skirt past the point that we're looking at a tremendous amount of intelligence here at a level that, you can't quite get. Well, okay, good. In what you said there is I'm going to put in the fact that I think there's a coevolution too. I think it's very likely that not only did we have a system that the plant was able to provide, and thus we nurtured it. I think in nurturing it, it gave us things that we didn't have, to which we adapted. In other words, we can use. Oh, look, there's this that's coming in, and we don't know what to do with that. But hey, I can think of something. And
That's right.
then our genetics would evolve to establish a closer relationship. Is that plausible?
I think it's quite plausible given enough time.
Right, of course.
But there's different types of evolution. There's classical Darwinian evolution, random chance. There's social evolution where we learn from each other. So obviously 5,000 years ago, someone said, hey, this plant makes you feel good, and they passed that information down. Some of that clearly has been lost. And then there's the field of epigenetics where it modulates things. So I believe we had the hard wiring possible a long, long time ago, but it was only a possibility. Now, or it happened very infrequently at a low-level intensity. Now, when we can do something to make it ramp up in a favorable way, then those who can access the signal, cannabis, and are more sensitive to it, they're going to have an evolutionary advantage. Let's say there's an advantage not to feeling horrible pain all the time.
Right.
Then that will be Darwinianly passed along, which is remarkable. So clearly, over enough time, we've been selected for it.
Right. And then epigenetics is a whole interesting study that basically takes the concept of that, plug and random evolutionary thing and lets it happen. Lets basically an evolutionary step happen very quickly because it's potentiated. It's sitting there waiting, and look, I can do something with that. Boom. Okay, well that's a trait we're going to now pass on because
Well,
or make express more.
epigenetics can't happen that fast, but what it can say, because what it can say is we can produce a chemical reaction on that protein or that cell that we're not going to let it work, or we're going to potentiate it so it can kind of attenuate the good and the bad. It still needs enough time
Right.
randomly to succeed, but this can happen extremely quickly in evolutionary terms. That is unbelievable, and this was unknown. It's really something just beyond fascinating that's come out in the last 20 years.
Right, and that's a whole area that would be fun to go into. I know of some of it, but don't really understand it, and so just as a little bookmark there, maybe we'll have to come back to that later. All right, so as far as cannabis goes, what now you've studied a fair bit in terms of the medical aspects of CBD, cannabidiol and THC. Um, so let's go there a bit. I really don't want to make this discussion about marijuana. I want to make it about cannabis as a whole thing, which also includes all the other aspects of hemp. In other words, because I mean, here we're talking about the chemical interaction with humans. That's mainly what we're studying is right now. So I don't want to go off necessarily into all the other things that the hemp plant can provide and say, oh well, it provides a little bit, and that's what gets propagated, and so then we can do all these other things with it, like from construction to to paper and all that. But where should we go from here I'm kind of at a lean on your expertise now.
Sure, let me help. First of all, my knowledge is based on years of experience, but the intense study is actually relatively recently, and it was brought up and attenuated and heightened by the fact that now it's become much more available. People are interested in it. And as a physician, I need to know it and see what is the good and the bad about it. That's what really piqued my interest in the last year or two. Because before that, there wasn't a lot of information. There are certainly anecdotes, and anecdotes are not to be dismissed. People reporting things.
Right.
And it's passed down because of the legality issue. A lot of it was passed down informally, and a network has developed. There's clearly good information out there. There's not so good information. It hasn't been evaluated, but so that's what piqued my interest. Now, as far as the cannabis, you can talk about the one part which most people want to talk about, which is the euphoric agent THC, which was synthesized in the 60s by an Israeli chemist and a brilliant person who's now about 80 years old. But that you would be missing the vast majority of the benefit of cannabis, because you would be missing out on the major component, which is the cannabidiol. And that has zero euphoric properties, but it has some rather impressive properties that are now being studied. And if I can help set the context, prior to 2014, it was related to me that the federal government, the U.S. federal government, would not allow studying of cannabis unless it was for addiction or the downsides of it, which clearly need to be studied and evaluated. But there was no medical funding coming from the federal government on the positive or potential positive uses of this, which in most things in medicine, there's a risk of benefit, and there's also a risk of harm. So, and also you were only able to study it in the United States if you bought it from one farm in Mississippi run by the federal government. So there's really a lot of restriction on the use. So some of this now is starting to come out. That is what's really piqued my interest.
Oh, yeah. So scientifically, we're just really starting to get aboard the train. This 10,000 or more year interaction, which has been cut off for 80 years largely,
Correct. It's probably more like 5,000, although I think it goes well beyond 5,000 because that's all we have recorded history of. But it's very clear this has been used for a very long time. And I would say 5,000 years ago, a lightning bolt didn't come upon one person.
Right.
It had divine intervention. They clearly had been passed down.
Right. I mean, arguments could be made for much, much longer than that, even. But back and forth,
Very wise arguments.
I don't want to debate. I don't want to debate that particular point. But
sure.
the main point is that there is obviously an interrelationship which has been largely severed for the last nearly 80 years. I mean, and it would be in and out prior to that too. Because people go forward and lose track of the hemp, or they bring it, or then it gets introduced, and that's I'm sure an ebb and flow throughout civilization. But right now we're getting into a point of actual study, not really open study yet. What's the progress on that? I know it was restricted for a long time where you could only, and it's still kind of sticky. Especially in the U.S., but what are we finding in terms of the results? Let's not beat up on the fact that it hasn't been. Where have we gotten to in terms of discoveries relating to cannabidiol, which is CBD, right? That's how it's.
That is true.
That's how
CBD,
it's referred to as CBD, and that's the non psycho-interactive components.
That's correct. The sad thing to me is that the anecdotal information, which of the benefits of it, a lot of it has been lost, but a lot of it was forced underground because of the illegality. And so there's a vast knowledge out there, but people are reluctant to speak about it. So in my clinical practice, I actually have to tease this out of patients. What do you know about it? And it's harder to find. It's not easily to do it. The current state of research appears to be, there's a lot of animal studies out there that show very positive results. And I referenced some information I gave you. The clinical results, there's a lot of anecdotes, and now there's a lot of effort since 2014 in formally studying it in much more rigorous scientific means. But we should never dismiss the anecdotal studies. There's a reason why a lot of people are using it for non-euphoric reasons, and to dismiss that is really doing a disservice to the future of medicine.
Oh, absolutely. And I have, my own experience with that, not so much personally as my ex, who was in a lot of pain, and we started getting her some CBD, full spectrum CBD, and it's made a huge difference. And then as we up the concentration, she finds it's much more easy to regulate all that. So
I would agree. And the other thing I would like to see is the information like this. Now, we are doing some retrospective studies that have been beneficial in some of the states that have legalized the use of cannabis. The opiate use has gone down because THC and CBD potentiates the effectiveness. For a given dose of opiates, you need less of them to get the same level of pain relief. That's very interesting in this heightened concern about opiate problems. The other thing is that people are using it. Clearly, the biggest use now has been for seizures and anti-inflammatory reasons. Seizures in kids that were previous refractory, they couldn't control them. Sometimes there's amazing results. Now, it's not 100%. I've been through enough cycles in medicine where they promise everything and it doesn't come through, but there's something to study. And again, this chemical is amazingly safe. CBD and certainly THC is very safe too. So we have a safe chemical that's relatively inexpensive. Now, the impressive thing is by letting patients use this, they can control its use. So we're getting a lot of information, and most of our research is not patient controlled. It's we design a study and tell them how to do it.
Right.
Well, this is generating a lot of decentralized experimentation.
Well, I
I find it
remember
fascinating.
I remember my decentralized experimentation way back into the 70s. Yeah, 60s and 70s. Lots of decentralized experimentation, though regrettably that kind of experimentation is driven in not necessarily the most productive direction. Whereas now I know of people who use it for use both CBD and THC for pain and for various things on that anecdotal, individually patient controlled thing. And I think that's really important. That brings us back to decentralization and why, excuse me, and why cannabis is itself a very important thing to move forward in terms of decentralizing our control and responsibility for our own circumstances, which is probably one of the main reasons it was suppressed, if you want to get conspiratorial about it. But we won't go there right now. But, but yeah, let's examine that. You've touched on it. I don't know if there's any more to say on this point of the decentralizing effect of this in terms of medical condition and individual responsibility and smaller units of interaction responsibility, because you get this, okay, it's got to be stamped by the FDA, then you get acceptable channels that go down, and anybody who's doing something differently is wrong, which they wouldn't necessarily be, but you really lose the tremendous adaptability of that complex interaction that we're talking about with the chemical, the fabulous back and forth. So what do you have to say about all that?
I would agree with you. There's a role for decentralized information gathering. There clearly is a role for centralized information gathering. They're not mutually exclusive.
Not at all.
There's no need for randomized controlled studies when the information is so obvious. There's a famous study that talks about, no one has ever done a double-blind study to show that parachutes decrease traumatic deaths, where one group jumps and one group doesn't, where they have a crossover study. It was written up in the British Medical Journal. But they always say when someone says we need to do a randomized study, bring up the parachute study, but always be kind, John. Say, you go first. So when its information is obvious, we don't need to test it. And the biggest thing is now with disseminated information, I'll give you an example. Medical research is very expensive to do in a centralized manner. But if we can gather the information, let's say with your iPhone, it's now being used for research unrelated to, potentially related, but right now unrelated to medication for Parkinson's. Well, when you have an iPhone that has an accelerometer that you can measure people's walking, this can disseminate the information gathering and make it cheap. Well, the same thing, if we can gather those many little pieces of information and coalesce it, saying that's where clinical experience comes in. I talk to people, and you always have to weigh the risk of benefit versus the risk of harm. Well, if people are facing, in the case of multiple sclerosis, a miserable condition, there's not many options available, and we can decrease the spasticity with a chemical that is basically has almost no known fatalities by itself.
Right. And those that are there are due to contamination of mycotoxins and things like that. Yeah.
But compared to almost any medicine I legally prescribe.
Oh yeah. Even taking the worst case, it's so much better than almost anything.
So
yeah.
We need to gather that information. Some of this won't be studied. There's not enough money in it, but this is what you get from dealing with patients. And I often thank them because I teach residents and mid-level clinicians, nurse practitioners, PAs. I thank the patients for sharing this anecdotal information that lets me weigh what I know scientifically. But we know when there's a centralized system, it has to pass through gatekeepers. And generally, the federal government, even if they've changed the prohibition, are not going to suddenly change and say we now find it acceptable when certain government agencies still believe there is no known medical use for cannabis. That strikes most people, especially physicians, as being rather absurd.
Right.
So we can allow the experimentation to go on, and we can learn from our patients. That's what I think is most important. And a couple themes tend to come up. Now, could it be random chance? Yes, but if we have a safe medicine and it can be used safe medically, and it's relatively inexpensive, and it doesn't prevent other known cures, I think it's reasonable to learn more about it.
Right. Now, somewhere in the middle of what you were talking about there, I got an image that I want to share. It's one of those things that, my head just kind of goes boom, and go, oh my goodness. And I'm maybe delusional here, but I got the picture, looking from the microcosm to the macrocosm, so to speak, in our earlier discussion about the tremendous complexity of the protein molecules and the receptor interactions and so forth. I kind of blew that up into looking at civilizationally here with the communication systems, especially, which we now have available to us in the internet, and the cryptographic securities of being able to relate things in different ways and verify them as true or false to some degree, to at least as what they are. The truth and falseness is another layer. But when you're talking about, people going out and having their experiences interacting with this product or with this chemical compound, the plant, whatever, they're going to have those experiences, and those experiences are going to lay much like activators over receptors of the civilization. And those will communicate certain messages along paths that are quite complex, but end up in a very decentralized bringing together of the organism, put it that way.
Correct. And the way I would think about it is there's got to be an app for that, because now
exactly,
if you have that decentralized information and you can measure it, now you can put it on a 5-point scale, but even a thumbs up, thumbs down for the condition, and you can input it easily, then it makes, for me, target and information recognition very important. So we might find that in certain things it works very well, and there's discerning things about it. But we have to have that information to see the patterns. And this is where decentralization can be extremely beneficial if we can combine it and watch big data. Wow, we have a lot of people that we find this useful for. So your insight, I think, is very useful.
Well, thank you. It kind of left me with that little hum that I don't know exactly what to do with other than kind of bask in it. So,
well, remember you talked earlier about the entourage effect, the effect of chemicals additive. It's more than the sum of the individual parts. When I have a discussion with you, I'm learning from you, I'm thinking about it, I'm providing feedback, and there's an entourage effect. It is not just 1 plus 1. We get a magnification of the effect because we're sharing information, and then the longer we talk, I start seeing patterns, and I say, well, that's an insight that I don't have. And I would be a fool, and I try to minimize that as much as possible. I learn from you.
Right, and vice versa, and all of
us.
And that is what the interconnection provides. Wow, that's fabulous. So, looking to wrap up here, this has been, I think this is quite interesting. We may have to do some follow-up and trace down some of these other lines, but I think we've done a good coverage there. Is there anything you feel would be good to cap with for this?
I would say, John, the journey is just beginning. Go forward with open eyes, be receptive to new ideas, and it's a learning experience. We will base it upon our insight, accept or reject, but we should go with it with open eyes. That's what I think is going to be really impressive, and I look forward to continued learning and continue speaking with you about it.
Well, excellent, Jim. Thank you very much. And before we wrap up here, I do want to interject one thing so I can just do this all in one shot. And this is going out to the listeners. It takes a lot of time and effort to do this, and I do, and I love it, and I will do it regardless. But I'm looking at how to ease the burden so that I can do less of other things that I need to do to put food on the table and gas in the tank and so forth, and to afford me to do this more and better. And I've looked at various things, and I will continue to, but I wanted to float this out to the listeners to get some feedback, because your actual feedback will tell me how real this is. I'm looking at opening up a Patreon campaign. I haven't gone through the effort of doing it, but if I get some feedback that, hey, I'm willing to do something, whatever, if I get enough feedback, I'll be interested in pursuing that. So if you can communicate either at on the Let's Talk Bitcoin Network forum, or you can email simpleton@safecrossroads.net. And I would really appreciate your feedback if you do appreciate what I'm doing enough to make either an episodic, per episode or per month. Just let me know what you think and what your preferences are, and we'll move forward from there. Does that sound like a pretty good idea, Jim?
I certainly like it. Crowdsource and let people vote with their feet.
Exactly. It's more of this using the anyway. I won't try and make the analogy. Well, all right. Well, that wraps it up. Thank you all very much for participating in this episode number 20 of Technology and Choice. And till next time. Thanks a lot, Jim.
Thank you, John.